Really excited to see this many people that are visiting us from out of town, filling this this ballroom. As a faculty member here at Fort Lewis, I've been in this ballroom a lot, oftentimes hearing about not really exciting things, administrative meetings and stuff like that. So this is really exciting to be able to talk about what we really love, which is plants, right? So as a member of the Fort Lewis College faculty, I really felt that I should first welcome all of you to our wonderful campus here in Durango. Obviously, I know some of you are here from Durango, so it's not really visiting from too far, but a lot of you are actually from out of town, and so it's really exciting, and I truly welcome you to kind of take some time to look around our campus. Particularly would like to recommend that you kind of go to the western side of campus. It's an area that we call the Rim, and there's a nice trail that kind of walks along there, looks out over the city of Durango, and it gives you an absolutely excellent introduction to what we call the mountain shrubland community, which is the basic community type that we have here around the city of Durango. Okay. Now, like any good, college educator, right? I think that my best classes, my best lectures always start with a quiz, and students absolutely love it, right? So I am going to start with a pop quiz here. And this pop quiz is it's really simple. It's just called Name That Plant, okay? So I'm going to show you a picture. Think about it for a moment. Don't yell it out because, you don't want to look like you're trying to brown nose the teacher or something here. Oh, I know it. So I got a plant here. You got one here, so to think about it a little bit. We can zoom in on the flowers a little bit if you like that. Kind of look at it. It probably looks really familiar to a lot of people, but maybe not quite 100% familiar. Either. What you got? Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Does anyone want to throw out a name on this? All right. That's excellent. Yes. No, it's not the genus Nicotiana. It is the genus Solanum. Yes. All right. We are getting really warm here. No. Oh, okay. All right. This here is a species called Solanum jamesii. Has anyone ever heard of this before? Any show of hands? Oh, a couple hands back there. Excellent. Okay. So Solanum jamesii is a really interesting species here in Colorado. It's only native in the far southern tier. There's a little bit of it that we can find over in the southern San Luis Valley. And then over here in the southwestern part of the state, we know of this from two locations. One of them is Chimney Rock National Monument, and the other is Mesa Verde National Park. Now, this photo was not taken in either one of those locations. And it turns out that I took this photo 3 weeks ago, actually one afternoon that I took my plant systematics class out on a 3-hour-long field trip. And all that we did is we went about 6 to 7 miles north of Durango to a little place in the San Juan National Forest because it's super close to get to. And I was teaching students a little bit about how to key some plants in the field, how to recognize them. And we just happened to walk up to this. I wasn't expecting this at all. But I saw it and I got super excited. And like I always do in class, I started to geek out a whole lot. And students are like, okay, wow, my professor's really going off the deep end here. But what's interesting about Solanum jamesii, and the reason that we only find a few little plot spots here in southern Colorado, is that it's associated with old archaeological sites. Solanum jamesii makes these tiny little tubers that ancient peoples in our region used to cultivate. And they would move these around, mostly from their native range, a little bit further in Arizona and New Mexico, and then they would come up to the north. And that's why we find it associated with places such as Chimney Rock National Monument and Mesa Verde. So where we found this just north of Durango also has some archaeological ruins, not big like Mesa Verde, but we now have the botanical evidence that shows people were in this particular area, and no one had ever bumped into it before. And I bumped into this in a 3-hour college lab one afternoon. And it turned out that that day was absolutely pretty incredible because I also found some other plants, such as this species of Nama, which is not a rare species, but it certainly is not common in our area, and another species of Femaranthus that is also not particularly common. So this one 3-hour lab trip in the afternoon turned up 3 super unique plants, and it gave me the chance to do what I do really well, or at least I think I do really well, and I think I really love doing, which is being a botanical educator. I have kind of made it my life's work to teach about plants and to make it that people are really excited about plants. And to do this for over, oh gosh, it's probably like almost 20 years now of teaching within a college setting about botany. Now, for those of us, I know there's a few of you out there in the audience because I talked to you already. There's a few of you who are involved in botanical education as a profession. And within the last few years, there's been maybe the last decade or so, there's been these doom and gloom papers that have been coming out. Things like the death of botany, the academic decline, the botanical education extinction, or you get like great names like the end of botany. Like, okay, so as a botanical educator, someone who does this, I say, whoa, 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 this is crazy. Is my whole field dying? We're never going to have botanists. And, you know, I see what they mean. There's not as many programs in botany as there used to be. Maybe as many students don't go into it. But some of it's also because we just don't put the money into it. We don't have the enthusiasm to continually teach students how to actually get excited about plants. And so I've kind of taken it on throughout my entire career, as well as after reading things like this, to say, well, I'm going to continue to do this. And so we actually bucked the trend here at Fort Lewis College, and a few years ago, we are probably, I haven't done a systematic study of this to really check for sure, but we actually developed a dedicated botany major. So students can actually major in botany with a specific degree that is geared specifically toward the training of students in land management for the conservation and management of plant resources, particularly in US government, state, and tribal agencies. And so we specifically crafted a major like that. And so I continue to be this botanical educator. And as a botanical educator, I try to cover the whole range of botany. I'll talk about things such as the physiology of plants. I'll take students out into the field to learn them how to identify plants. I'll work with plant ecology. How do plants work within their environment? I've also focused on the development of herbaria and training students in the modern methods of how do we take herbarium collections and make them available to the world. Now, I've also been very much involved in student research. And one of the primary things that I do in my classes is I do utilize a method that we call course-based undergraduate research. So here at Fort Lewis, we don't have a graduate program. So I don't have the ability to do large-scale research with your undergraduate students. So what I do is I embed research within classes. And it's a little slow to kind of get it moving, but what it does is it exposes students to the questions that we would ask as botanical scientists, and then have them work on that, learn how to be a scientist. And even if they don't become botanists, which is okay too, you know, I actually really do appreciate those students who are pre-med and they want to go off and be a good doctor. I actually really appreciate that. But what they do is they, of course, learn how to be good scientists. And so I've done lots of different types of projects, have mentored over 50 different research undergraduate theses, all focused in botany, ranging from things in phylogeography research to floristic surveys, pollination biology research, with some other bizarre things. I did a project one time where we were trying to see what kind of responses are there to your touching your plants. We could get into that. That was an interesting study. But ultimately, what I want to do is I want students to get out. I want them to experience plants. I want them to feel plants, and I want them to know them. And this can only happen by working closely with students, by getting them out into the field, getting them to know the plants that I love and the plants that they will learn to love. A fun story really quick. I have lots of them, but I'll try to rein them in. This here's a picture from a class that I just taught this past summer. I teach a class in plant identification where we basically are mostly meeting outside. And this is probably one of the few local pictures. It's not actually in Colorado. It's in New Mexico, but it's about 500 meters from the border with New Mexico, with Colorado and New Mexico. So pretty close. But I had a student who really loved the class. We're learning how to make plant collections. And I saw her again at the beginning of this semester and just sort of asked her, hey, you know, how was the rest of your summer and all? And she said, oh, you know what I did after class? I went back home and my dad and I made a plant press. My dad, we got in his little workshop, we made a plant press, and I went out and pressed some plants. said, whoa, this is great. This is absolutely wonderful. And I asked, of course, my next question is, okay, so what cool things did you collect? And I didn't really get much there, but that's okay. You take what you can get, right? All right, now, in addition to being a botanical educator, I'm, of course, also a botanical researcher. That's what got me into this. Originally, I was interested in questions of plant ecology, working with rare plants, started to work with demographics and the building of demographic models to show plant growth through time. That kind of morphed into a study of plant evolution, plant systematics, taxonomy, and then kind of branched from there into other studies of population genetics, which moved into a lot of different types of systems. So just a couple of them here. I got the chance to work with population genetic structure of epiphytic orchids. I've also been doing work in other areas of South America, a study I did a number of years ago studying a small microendemic species in southeastern Brazil and trying to understand how did it get there, what was its patterns of genetic variation, how can we use that for conservation. More recently, I've been kind of getting into questions of island biology, and had a few years ago was able to go to the Galapagos Islands, and I'm hoping to go back because I have some more work to do, but working with some of the iconic groups that we find within those island systems. First off, working with a group that we call Darwin's daisy trees. These are asters that grow as large overstory trees, and they are absolutely incredible. I've also been working on another group that is kind of a group that's not much loved, but I love it, and I've been working with it for my entire career in the Amaranthaceae. Not a lot of people sort of gravitate to the Amaranthaceae, but they got some really cool questions, and some of them are the shrubs that are native within the Galapagos. And as we can see here, we have a shrub in the front. Actually, my son at the time, well, he was probably about 7 at the time. Now he's a little bit bigger, but he was standing in front of that, and then behind him, we actually have a cactus tree. So those are really cool too. We can think of little cactus here. There they grow as trees. Really pretty fun. Now, I am not only someone who likes to travel around the world looking at plants. Yes, that is wonderful. But I do always come home here to Colorado, where I have been working here at Fort Lewis now, and this is my 16th year. And when I'm back here, what I do is I kind of dive every summer into the plants that we have in Southwest Colorado. So here with a good friend of Fracera, everyone loves Fracera. It's just beautiful. So you got to give it a hug sometimes. Or get up high into the Alpine looking for these tiny, tiny little things. And so I go around the region and I make lots of collections. And so just around the close area here, I've collected over 2,000 specimens documenting the flora of the area here in southwestern Colorado. The main goal for this is to increase our knowledge about what is around here. It's amazing, but there's lots of things that we still don't know about the flora of Colorado, particularly in this part of the state. And I'd say also in parts of the plains. And so part of that is just to document what we have, and it also contributes to our herbarium here at Fort Lewis College. We have, and I've built up over the years, what is now the 5th largest herbarium within the state of Colorado here in Durango. And we're the largest such collection in the Western Slope. And so that's a wonderful resource for science. It's also a wonderful resource for education. My collecting is kind of focused mostly on areas that haven't been well studied. So this is an area known as the HD Mountains. It's just to the east of Durango a little bit, kind of the southern end of the Rockies. I did a floristic survey in here that was actually mostly student-led back in 2021. And recently I've been getting into another area to the west, just on the eastern side of the Mesa Verde Cuesta, that's BLM land, that's known as the Weber Mountain Wilderness Study Area. Difficult to get into, but this is an area that has actually never been studied by botanists at all. There are no collections at all. So I've started to get into here a little bit and try to see what is there. And this is going to continue for a number of years to see, what we have. So what I want to do for the rest of my talk here is I want to kind of take you on a little trip. And this trip is going to kind of introduce you to a few things around Southwest Colorado and a few of the things that I've researched with my students over the years. There's no way that I can, in a short amount of time, cover the entire flora of Southwest Colorado. We'd never do it. It'd be super boring. So I'm going to try to just hit a few things. And I want to start with us thinking about our state of Colorado. All right, our state is really cool, right? We kind of have, it's kind of like a giant square. In the east, we have the plains. In the center, we have the Rocky Mountains. And in the west, we have the Colorado Plateau. Each one of these three regions have very distinct floras, and they all feel very different from one another. Now, here in the southwestern corner of the state, you notice we're right at this junction between the Colorado Plateau and the Southern Rocky Mountains. And I can see this really well if I go for a hike out behind my house, because my house is located on the rock strata that is the Southern Rockies. But if I walk a half mile to the south, I cross into a different rock strata that's part of what we call the San Juan Basin, which is part of the Colorado Plateau. And it's like someone just drew a line through the forest. You see the whole vegetation change from Rocky Mountain type vegetation to Colorado Plateau vegetation. And that's really fun. And so what I've enjoyed about being a botanist here is that if I want Colorado Plateau vegetation, I just walk one direction. If I want to be up in the mountains, I walk the other direction. And I can do this all year. And it's really pretty exciting. So what I want to do is I'm going to make a little transect, right? Just to throw in a nice ecological, sampling method for you. We're going to take a little transect from the southwestern corner of Colorado and come up sort of around the Durango area and then end up into the high Rockies and just show you a few of the types of plants that we could find within these different regions of southwestern Colorado. And where I want to start is right down at the Four Corners. This is a photo that was taken from the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, probably about 10 miles to the northeast of the actual Four Corners itself. And notice what we have here. We have this very dry kind of semi-desert environment. It's kind of a semi-desert shrublands. A lot of the plants you see are actually shrubby. They're just really, really tiny. But it's also mixed in with a lot of shales and badlands that really don't support a lot of plant growth, but the growth that they do support tends to be very unique. We have a very high concentration of endemic species within this type of an environment. We can then move in just a little bit further to a place probably a lot of us know and like, which is Mesa Verde. And who's planning on their trip to go visit Mesa Verde while you're down here? All right, one hand. I should see lots of hands. This place is awesome. But Mesa Verde is really fun. It's this uplift out of the Colorado Plateau that will span a vegetation where you will move at its base from some of these sort of shrublands up into pinyon juniper forest, and finally, at its highest elevations, start to get into some of the ponderosa pine woodlands. Now, this area, of course, has a lot of really cool plants, and most of this is going to be occurring in the spring. So I find that my spring is pretty much taken up by going out to these areas of far western Colorado. I'll admit, yes, I do go over to New Mexico and Utah as well, just because they're right there and they're cool, but I won't show you pictures of plants from there because we want to focus on Colorado, right? So we have a lot of really neat things. Some of our castilleias that only occur in the desert environments. Things like the phlox, pedicularis, and a number of us might know from pedicularis that grow up in the mountains. We have this really cool little one that grows in the understory of pinyon juniper forest, pedicularis centranthera. Really beautiful blooming thing early in the spring. Another one, Fraxinus anomala, is a really cool species that you find much more common as you head further west if you get over in the Canyonlands area, but it ekes into parts of eastern and southwestern Colorado, or western Colorado and southwestern Colorado as well. Really a fun little single-leafed ash. All right, now, of course, we also have other things that you generally would think of your sort of semi-desert to desert environment, such as cacti, some of the yuccas. There's a great diversity of these in our region. They're obviously quite beautiful. Now, what I've been really interested in terms of the flora in this portion of the state is one of the most speciose groups. And I've been working on this probably for the last 5, 6, 7 years, hard to say exactly, but is the genus Astragalus. And who out here has ever had time or sat down with a key for Astragalus and tried to determine species? Anyone ever had that joy? Oh, look at that. Who enjoyed it? Right on. Yes. Yeah. Who wants to do more? Yeah. Well, if you want to do more, southwestern Colorado is your place, because within a 60-mile radius of the Four Corners, we have 60 different species. Now, some of those are in New Mexico, Utah, et cetera, but that is still a lot of species. And it turns out that 12 of these are actually super narrow endemics that we don't find anywhere else. So I've been starting to do work on a lot of these to sort of answer this big question. Why do we have so many endemic species of astragalus here? What is going on? And so just a brief, few of these things like really dramatic, Astragalus coltonii, I've already moabensis, Astragalus amphioxys. We have tiny little things like Astragalus monumentalis, absolutely beautiful species, most of which are, of course, blooming in the spring. Now, I've been particularly interested in 3 of these species, and these are the ones that I've spent most of the time investing work into. And these are 3 species that are narrow endemics here in the southwestern corner of Colorado. Probably some of you know of these. Astragalus schmoelliae is one that's well known. It's endemic to Mesa Verde National Park and just a small bit of the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation. And it's really pretty abundant in Mesa Verde National Park and has been a candidate for endangered species listing, et cetera. Astragalus deterior is another smaller species having a similar kind of range, but it occurs on that southern escarpment of Mesa Verde, occurring in very, very shallow soils at the top of the sort of south-facing cliffs. And then lastly, probably one of our most interesting species is Astragalus tortipes. This is a small species with an incredibly tiny range just on the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation. And so I've been doing a lot of work to sort of further conservation efforts of these species. And I just wanted to share a couple cool things that I've sort of found out about these. I won't dive into all the data because I'll be here for another 2 hours and we don't want to do that. There's other people who can talk. So the first off, Astragalus schmoelliae, for the longest time, there's been this question, why is this thing here? Where is it? And there have been a number of hypotheses that have been put out regarding the origin of this species. Well, it turns out that these hypotheses about weird hybrid origin and things like that probably aren't actually what they are. It turns out that its closest relative is actually this relatively very bright sort of pink to light purple thing called Astragalus coltonii. And they share vegetative forms almost identically. Their habitat is identical, and it turns out their genetic relatedness is almost identical as well. And what we have is a rare case of a change of flower color. We actually see this happens within other groups in Astragalus, where there can be a small mutation leading to a change in flower color, and then it turns to be isolated. And it was now isolated on the Mesa Verde Cuesta, in addition to having that change of flower color, and hence now it has isolated itself as a unique species. The other species, Astragalus deterior, is actually a species that's really going to be requiring a lot more conservation effort in the near term. But it turns out that this species is part of this large complex of rimrock dwelling species that occurs from southwestern Colorado, south into parts of northwestern New Mexico, up western Colorado until you get to the Colorado River Basin, and then over into parts of eastern Utah. This is a complex of species known as Astragalus naturatensis, desperatus, Astragalus monumentalis. These are all interdigitated. And so what I'm doing now is trying to figure out what are the species boundaries in this group? How can we actually continually recognize them? Because genetically, they're all thrown into the same big melting pot. It really makes a nice mess, but a lot of work. Now, the last one of these, Astragalus tortipes, we find that this really unique thing is actually the result of a rare hybridization event. What I've been able to do is study this species utilizing DNA from the nuclear genome and DNA from the plastid or chloroplast genome, and we find that they are completely different from one another, indicating the most the best explanation for that is we probably have a case of recent hybridization that has given rise to the unique form that we have. So that's kind of an interesting story. I'd like to investigate that a little bit more. Okay, I want to continue on our transect a little bit and kind of move out of the drier regions of the southwest corner and start moving up in elevation into the foothills and particularly into the area around Durango. So this area we kind of call the foothills, we call it the mountain shrubland, and we also have sort of an oak pine transition zone. So this here's a photo looking from just a little bit north of Durango out into the Animas Valley and kind of tucked in there just on the bottom side of that that view into the valley is where Durango itself would be. And so this area is really characterized by a big understory of oak, pinyon juniper forest, which then transitions into ponderosa pine forest. And just a few of the plants that we have in here, that some of which are relatively common, a few of these which are not, that you're just going to find in this region, things like Orthocarpus purpuralbus, something that we tend to just find in this region. Lathyrus pauciflorus, this is something that we will only see kind of eking into this part of the state, but be a little bit more common into the west. And of course, not a super small range here in Colorado. It actually has a pretty sizable range of Fendlera. But if you visit Durango in the spring, our hillsides are absolutely covered with Fendlera rupicola, and it is absolutely gorgeous. These white blooms come out and just sort of overtake Durango, and I absolutely love it. Now, this is a species probably all of us know and love, right? Quercus. We love Quercus. And I'm going to hold back from my numerous papers on Quercus and just talk about this one species, Quercus gambellii, right? Our common one. Now, if you're here around Durango and you take hikes into some of the natural areas around town, every once in a while, you're going to see something that looks like this. All right. Now, does that look like Quercus gambellii to anybody? Not quite. It's kind of a weirdo thing. It just shows up and that's that. But what it is this is actually what we call a stabilized hybrid. It's called Quercus biturbinella. And what it is it is a hybrid form between Quercus gambellii and Quercus turbinella. And Quercus turbinella is a species of oak that occurs further to the south. You can find it if you get down to around Farmington. Aztec, New Mexico is sort of the northern part of its range. But in the past, you have various climatic fluctuations that lead to the ranges of these species changing through time. And then the species come into what we call sympatry, or they're growing together, and they have the ability to hybridize. And when they hybridize, they can give rise to hybrid offspring, which don't necessarily have the morphology of either one of the two species. And so this form that you see here on the left is a stabilized hybrid form that remains within this area, and you can still find it every once in a while. They seem to grow as clones that can probably live for thousands of years. And so they exhibit themselves here right around Durango. All right, so this is what things are starting to look like this time of year. Actually, I think it's speeding up a little bit more than some other years, right? We get this great, as we kind of move up in elevation, we get this great color. You know, it's one of the things that we look for here in Colorado in the fall is this gorgeous change of color. But what we're doing is we're moving up in elevation into our montane woodlands. And our montane woodlands, I kind of see them as starting in sort of the ponderosa pine zone, moving into the aspens, moving into our mixed conifers, and then finally moving up into our spruce forests before they finally kind of disappear into our alpine. And we have a lot of species that occur within this region, kind of because I'm demarcating as a very wide region. But a number of things in the spring, leading from things, really pretty things like Loesia to Collinsia, Lithophragma. Lots of these have relatively wide ranges in Colorado, but they are still really exciting to see come out every spring. Also, others in our forest, depending upon where you are in terms of elevation, we have orchids such as the calypso orchids. I can think of a number of beautiful places nearby where you can find large quantities of these, which is so fun to see. Things like caltha covering the ground for as far as you can see. Arctostaphylos, I don't usually catch it in bloom, but I did that time. Really beautiful to see. Now, there's also some things that get into our forest environments that are really, really rare, and things that, unless you are right here in southwestern Colorado, you're probably not going to see. So I just am showing you a couple things that occur in this environment. One of them on the left there is a thing called Tritilia grandiflora, and I would bet very, very few people have ever seen this here in Colorado. The species, based on the range map, is actually pretty common up in the Pacific Northwest, and then it gets down pretty common in parts of northern Utah. But it's only known from one little location to the northwest of Durango, and that's it. And I have to say, when you get in that location, it looks pretty non-spectacular. It looks like any other piece of ponderosa pine forest I've ever been in. But there it is. All right. Another genus called Trotphyteria is another little ranunculaceae that is also really neat that we can see by its range map. Also only occurs in a few places in southwestern Colorado, even though it can be found elsewhere, particularly up into the Pacific Northwest. Not really what we'd consider to be a true rare species, but really, really cool to see it because it's not something we run into every day. All right, this is another one. My son makes it into a lot of pictures. This is another species called Aurelia bicrenata. And this also has a much more of a range, much to the south in Arizona and parts of New Mexico, but just ekes its way up into two locations in southwestern Colorado. One a little bit to the north of Durango. Doesn't take too long to get there, but kind of hidden, takes a really nice bushwhack with a lot of, well, I think when we went the last time, lots of mosquitoes, but it was still super cool to see, right? Another one that I want to point out is another absolutely wonderful spot, and I bet a couple of us have probably been to this particular spot. This is a place north of Durango that is a fen, very unique ecosystem for us here in the mountains, and this particular fen has a little claim to fame in that it is the host of this little species of Drosera. This is known as Drosera anglica. It's a small little sundew, and this is the only location where Drosera anglica occurs in the Southern Rockies. We can see from the range of Drosera anglica, you can find it again if you get up to sort of the northern part of Yellowstone National Park, and then continuing north into Canada. And I didn't want to put a giant map on the presentation here, but this species also occurs over into parts of northern Europe. So it has this circumboreal distribution, and this here is its southernmost population, just north of Durango. All right. Now, another species I want to point out from this sort of montane forest zone is Berberis fendleri. And who knows Berberis fendleri? Anyone seen this before? Oh, yeah, I definitely know this little shrub. All right, it has these nice yellow flowers. Somehow I couldn't find a picture of those, so I give you the fruits instead, which would be out this time of year. But it has this interesting distribution in that it's found from far eastern Utah all through southwestern Colorado and then into northern New Mexico. And that's it for the range of this species. All right, I mean, it's fine, but I start to ask why? Why is it here? Why is it here? And who is this related to? And through total serendipity, back in around 2013 or 14, I don't remember anymore, I was helping this research group out of England who was doing some work with this genus Berberis, and they asked for some tissue of Berberis fendleri. And I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. I went out, collected some, sent it off, kind of forgot about it. Well, it turns out that this was put into a large-scale worldwide phylogeny of the genus Berberis, and we found this really unique pattern of relationship, that Berberis fendleri is most closely related to a species known as Berberis koreana. Berberis koreana is an endemic to the Korean Peninsula, which is nowhere near southwest Colorado. So that starts to beg a question, right? What is going on between Korean Peninsula and southwestern Colorado, northern New Mexico, et cetera? So this ultimately led to a collaboration that I'm currently working on, so I only have some preliminary data, where I'm working with a colleague in Korea to study this particular disjunction, to understand when did it happen, and what is the pattern of diversity within the Korean species and within the species that we have here in sort of the southern end of the Southern Rockies. And so a little bit of preliminary data I was able to collect all over the range of Berberis fendleri, and then we sequenced this and developed, for those of you who know, a whole set of single nucleotide polymorphisms that we're then analyzing to understand the range-wide structure. And so what we're finding is there's some geographic structuring across this range for Berberis fendleri, but really there's a whole lot of gene sharing that goes on at the same time across this range. So we start to figure out, why is that? And if we start to dive into it, we realize that Berberis is actually a really ancient lineage within our region. In Western North America, we have fossils of Berberis going back 30 million years, if not more. And the fossil evidence shows that there was actually a wide diversity of Berberis all across Western North America. That diversity actually extended down into Mexico, where we don't find Berberis at all today. So the pictures that I have here are actually fossil Berberidaceae that come from the Creede flora, which is a fossil flora that can be found over around Creede, Colorado. And we had a huge diversity. So what we're seeing is that Berberis fendleri is actually a relic from the Oligocene time. So we're still working on the dating analysis and all of this, and we don't have all the data for the Korean stuff yet. I seem to recall there was some comment that the range of that species extends into North Korea, and it'd be really great to go get some samples from there. And I really hope he didn't decide to go do that. Maybe that's why he's been quiet for the last few months, but anyhow. All right, so as we continue on our transect across Southwest Colorado, we're finally going to get up into the mountains. And this is a lot of what we think of Colorado, right? We love our mountains. We have this big, giant spine of mountains running up the center of our state. So just a few mountain photos of things in the local area. This is kind of taken from an area up towards Red Mountain Pass, looking towards the west, the other side of the mountains there. You'd be getting over into Telluride. There's a little bit south of Silverton, an area known as Kendall Mountain and Whitehead Peak, looking into that area on the western side of the Wemmanooch Wilderness. We can then continue to move up. The other pictures kind of showing you around tree line. We can then move way up into the Alpine. This here is an early morning photo of what we know as Sheep Mountain, right on the Continental Divide. And we can look at some other pictures along the Continental Divide. This is looking towards an area called Half Peak, the headwaters of Pole Creek. Again, walking along the Continental Divide. Actually, the Continental Divide Trail will go and cut all the way across that area, sort of this side of what we're seeing, that Half Peak in the back there. Now, our alpine flora is something a lot of us love, and we seek out our alpine flora every year because of it's just fascinating. It lives in this harsh environment. It has this extremely short growing season, but not all of our alpine plants are the same. They actually have different origins, and it's interesting to think about those. So if we look at some of the species that we find here in southwestern Colorado, we have some species such as this, like Silene urulensis or Oxyria digynia. These are species that we would call Arctic alpine disjuncts, or what they are is species that we can find much more common into the north. So some of these you could find far north into Canada, or as far north as Greenland, but then they extend south along the spine of the Rockies, just in that alpine zone, because the environment is such that they can just kind of hang on. Something like Dryas octopetala that we see in the lower left there, this species actually meets the southern range of its distribution here in the San Juan Mountains. The one in the middle at the bottom, Schmoleskia, this is a species that has all of its close relatives in Alaska and Siberia. But again, it just beats down to our region here. Now, our alpine is not all just things that are kind of distributed really widely, from the Arctic down into our region. We also have things that might be particularly regional, and they just occur within a regional sense within the alpine. So a number of these things, like the species of Pedicularis sudetica or Claytonia megariza, these are things that may be occurring just within having a regional distribution. And we, of course, then have others that are relatively restricted. So these are species of the alpine we only find here in Colorado. Something like Townsendia rafrakii, Bessia alpina, Artemisia campestris. These are sort of Colorado endemics in the alpine region. And for finishing up here, I want to sort of finish with a story about our alpine endemic that probably a number of us know. But not all of us. And I just wanted to share one of the really interesting stories in Colorado botany. So if you've heard it before, you can go take a break and move on and do something else. Otherwise, hang on. This is about a species called Aliciella setifolia. And I'm sure a few of us have seen this, but not many people have seen this. It's a small little endemic that was first collected in 1893, even though there's some data that says 1892, and was described in 1899 by T.S. Brandegee. And I have a picture of its type specimen here. So we can see the tiny little species mounted right on the side of the sheet. I don't know why they mounted like this, but anyway, right on the side of the sheet there with a little label saying where it was collected, that it was collected from a mountain called Sheep Mountain in the Uncompahgre Range. All right, that sounds pretty good. Anyhow, the species was described, the type specimens filed away in an herbarium, and then it wasn't seen again. No one saw this plant again until 1995. And it wasn't in the Uncompahgre Range. It was actually to the east of Silverton along the Continental Divide. Turns out that the sheep mountain they're referring to was not actually in the Uncompahgre Range. It was actually a sheep mountain over along the Continental Divide east of Silverton. But the type locality was then, rediscovered, and we've since been able to discover that there's 5 populations of this that we know of in total in a relatively small area around the Continental Divide in that region. So the species is really fascinating. It has this biennial life history. The picture at the bottom is what it looks like when it's sort of in its first year, just growing as a small little rosette of leaves. And then in its second year, it will bolt. Now, when we mean bolt, we're meaning bolting to 4 to 6 centimeters bolting. It's not like, it's not like when you let your, artichokes go or something. It's a little bit different. The lowest elevation this has ever been collected from is 12,600 feet. So, we're not talking sea level here. Okay. And it likes this really unique habitat of sort of a mix of volcanic ash and tufaceous gravel. As you can see what that looks like in the lower left picture, that's not really happy environment. And we can look at the picture on the right is an area where you'd find some of these plants sort of scattered. This is sort of deep down in the middle of the Weminuche Wilderness. Now, when you have something super unique like this, I can't help myself then ask, again, the exact same question, why is it here? Why is it here? Why is it not anywhere else? Where did it come from? And so I did a project with students. As I said before, one of the things I like to do is course-based undergraduate research. So we focused a class on focusing on trying to understand where in the world does Alisciella setifolia come from? So students learn about the question, and then we learn all about the techniques that we use to sort of address that kind of question. And the data that we got out of this was kind of cool. We were able to put together a phylogeny of Alisciella that occurs within our general region, and then we're able to pinpoint it down to a relationship to species such as Alisciella pinnatifida, Alisciella pensteminoides, and we do some mapping. We call haplotype mapping, where we look at specific genetic mutations and then the relationships based on those occurrences of genetic mutations. And we found that the closest relative of our alpine endemic Alisciella setifolia is Alisciella pensteminoides. And for those of you who might know or not know, Alisciella pensteminoides is another endemic in Colorado, a little bit broader range, but it's only found within the Gunnison River, drainage. And it grows on rock faces. It's what we call a chasmophyte, only growing in these rock faces. And so it seems this is the relative. So the further question would be to examine more what happened. Were there climatic fluctuations that led to the ancestor of both of these species to move up in range, and then later they got isolated? Not sure, but what we see is a really cool pattern of relationship between these endemic species that we have here in Colorado. So I'm going to leave you with that particular example and just do a couple thanks out there. I want to give a thank out to my wife and partner in botany, Dr. Aurea Cortez Palomac. We are the botany family. We really torture our kids by both of us having PhDs in botany and looking at plants all the time. So I have to thank my kids for putting up with that. Also to many numerous funding sources that have kind of helped move these things along with students. And then lastly, of course, I have to thank my students. My students are the ones who kind of keep me going, who I keep trying to convince that botany is so cool. And I think a lot of them have kind of believed it. All right. So I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone wants. We can do that now if we have some time. I don't know how much time I have. But then if you have questions, I'm going to be around all day, so I'll be happy to talk later. And thanks everyone for kind of talking plants with me for an hour. I can read some questions now.
Yeah, I think honestly, let's do the questions now.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to sort of field those. Oh, you're gonna have one going around? Great. See a couple over there.
On your slide, you had a term, cytonuclear discordance.
Sorry about that.
What does that mean?
So what that means is, briefly, if you think about what you find in a cell, think about a plant cell, right? You've got your nucleus, where you've got all your DNA trapped in the nucleus, right? Okay. Now, within that plant cell, you also have chloroplasts, right? Now, chloroplasts have a whole separate genome in and of themselves. And it turns out, if we look at the patterns of inheritance for chloroplasts and nuclear DNA, the pattern of inheritance is not the same. So it's the same that we find in our own bodies. If you think about our own bodies, right, we also have DNA that's found in our nucleus, and we have DNA that's in our mitochondria. And our mitochondrial DNA is the same as our mother, because the mitochondrial DNA can only be passed via the egg. It cannot be passed via the sperm. So the same is true with a plant, in that the chloroplast DNA cannot be passed via the egg donor. It can only be passed via the pollen donor. And so what we find is that because the DNA of the nucleus and the chloroplast are inherited in different fashions, they don't necessarily show the same patterns of relationship. So this is what we call cytonuclear discordance. And one of the easiest explanations for why that occurs is if you have patterns of hybridization, where there was a hybrid where a pollen from another individual pollinated a plant, and then the chloroplast DNA will be passed on by the egg, but then the nuclear DNA will end up being a combination from the two parents. So that's the fancy term for saying that we don't have basically this exact same pattern of inheritance along the two different genomes that we find that we're sampling with inside the plant. Because the cool thing with plant, we actually have three genomes. We have the nuclear genome, the mitochondrial genome, and the chloroplast genome. So we have all kinds of cool data that we can tap into if you really want to. All right, so yeah. Sorry, I have to put my teaching hat on, my general biology hat. Any other questions? Yeah, what you got? Yeah, well, I guess they're a form of speciation. We know that there can be speciation. We know it's super common within astragalus, if you look at it worldwide, that they don't have very strong barriers to hybridization. And so hybridization can occur, and that they're interfertile. And so when they hybridize, they give rise to things that are kind of intermediate. There's this idea, the hybridization intermediacy hypothesis and such, that gives rise to these sort of intermediate forms. Most of these won't probably end up surviving, but they occur and then they just die out. Every so often, you tend to have a hybridization that those offspring survive, and then it turns out they're able to live sometimes within a new environment that might be different. Hybridization can sometimes give rise to the ability to exploit an environment that neither one of that the parents actually could survive in themselves. And so it's a very powerful way that plants are able to exploit new environments within their habitat. And so we see it in multiple plant groups, whereby hybridization is an important process in this development of new species. And it just happens to be that certain groups do that. And so why do we have 3,000 species of astragalus in the world? Probably because of this pattern of hybridization is one of the reasons. Yeah. I haven't really been paying close attention to that. I do think that there are changes, particularly in our higher elevations, where we're maybe getting more woody species. We're getting changes in flowering time. These are definitely big changes. They're not things that I have been tracking so much, so I don't want to speak about what have been my specific observations, but knowing from other researchers, we are definitely seeing changes that are hitting our alpine areas first, and then they're going to be kind of migrating down. So I do suspect that in the near future, we're going to be seeing changes and shifts to some of the ranges of our species. How do we deal with that? I don't have the answer, but we're going to be seeing it.